This week's topic was prompted by a suggestion from Binka Schwan, who is writing an article for the fall issue of Cast On that sort of goes into the same thing. So, and by the way, that black blob is George. Hey, Georgie. Hey, Georgie, come and say hi. Since Pettypaw is no longer with us, he does not let me out of his sight. Anyway, the topic is binding off. And particularly, I've done binding off in pattern, but what I have never done is binding off evenly. And it's one of those things where there's a couple of wrong ways to do it. If you notice this one, and by the way, in my blog, I'll have these all pinned and blocked and looking nice. This is too tight. The goal is to have it kind of match the cast on edge. And if it is pulling in at the top, it's too tight. This one is too loose. You can see that it again distorts the top edge. And then this one is just right. And I know these are itty bitty, and the reason for that is I have got a lot of knitting to do for the fall issue. So I'm going to do another one of those sweaters on size 0 needles. Yeah, that takes a lot of time. So anyway, this is just right. Notice that the top kind of matches the bottom. Now to do that, and this is going to be a very short video, I've got my stitches knit. I'm going to bind off. Now notice that my yarn is at the end of my right side, so I'm going to turn it and get ready for my bind off on the row afterwards. I prefer to bind off on the right side row if I can help it. And because the last stitch tends to be a bit large when you bind off, this is an easy fix. Thank you, Suzanne, for writing such a lovely long blog post, and I will put a link in my blog on the best way to do this. You knit the last stitch, because this is actually, if you turn it over, going to be the bind off. You just wrap the stitch the wrong way, the next to the last one, and what that does is it tightens up that last stitch. The problem with this is that you need to think of doing it on the row before the bind off and do it the second stitch in. But if you remember to do that, and Suzanne has a lovely long description in her blog about why this works and what the problem is. She's a very analytical knitter. Now I'm going to bind off. Now when I give tips for knitting, often I say use the tips of your needles when making increases and decreases, because that keeps them at a reasonable size. The one time you do not want to do that is when you bind off. If I bind off and use just my needle tips, the bind off is probably going to be a little tight. And when I do a bind off, I really insert my needle quite far, I noticed, onto the barrel of the needle. And what that's doing is it's keeping the stitches that size. And I actually, start to do the pullover when that stitch is fairly far down. Now the one thing you don't want to do is really yank on your working yarn, because that's going to pull the yarn from the previous stitches and it's going to make that loop smaller. George, leave the ball of yarn, alone. So I'm going to go in and insert the next one. Notice I'm going to the barrel of my needle, and then I'm going to pull it over and then slide it towards the end. And notice that these are, George is really distracting me, that these are fairly a reasonable size. And you can pull it a little tight, because if you don't pull it at all, you'll wind up with it too loose. But what you're looking for, and you can check it, is that the elasticity is about the same. Now admittedly, a bind off edge is going to provide more support than a cast on edge, and that's what you want. And I'm going to pull it over. And here's the last one where I have it going the wrong way, so I'm going to want to knit it through the back. And then knit that last one, and voila! Notice that that last stitch is not over large, and I have a really nice little swatch here. And that's all for this video.